Before I tell you a little bit more sort of about myself, just to kind of define what I'm not as much as what I am, there's a couple of things that would be helpful for me to maybe sort of find out in terms of who you are. So I have a few sort of questions that I want to begin by asking in order to find out really who is here, who we're speaking to, and who's about to be heard. So I'd like to know how many people in the room work or volunteer within artist-run spaces, initiatives and organisations. Okay. How many people here represent local authorities? Okay. How many people are county arts officers? How many people are artists who are not engaged in the running of artist-run spaces, initiatives or projects? Okay. How many representatives of the Arts Council are here? Okay. How many people who either within sort of within paid posts or sort of as freelancers conduct work in relation to policy or strategy? Okay. How many political pundits are there for cultural policy here? Okay. How many elected members, politicians, are in the room? Okay. How many academics who conduct research? Okay. Thank you. And the final question relates to a point I'll sort of make later on. For those of you who are engaged in the running of sort of artist-led spaces or initiatives, how many of you are working in situations where your annual turnover is over €1 million? Okay. So now I know who it is I'm talking to and who the conversation is happening amidst, which is kind of useful for me to sort of know. Before I sort of begin my sort of presentation, I want to return to sort of the first page on this, which is about footfall, before explaining a little bit more about myself. And I just want to remind us of a couple of sort of things from this, which is that this is a national sort of project and it is collaborative. So it has notions of collectivity within it, but it also has ideas of the polis written into it, or the commons, whichever way you want to sort of frame that. So we are already beginning from some notion of collectivity on one hand, and we are looking at basically a national sort of a picture, though in my presentation I may also argue that this is not only a national picture, actually this is a global picture, and it's a global situation as well. It is not a parochial sort of debate that is going to take place, and I will in one slide in a second sort of frame where I think footfalls potentially sits within a sort of global dynamic of discussion, debate around sort of artist run sort of or led or centred or initiated sort of projects. And the question of scale is written into this as well. So it says smaller, but it doesn't quantify it. It doesn't say smaller than what, sort of and obviously for those of you who are aware of common practice, the question I asked about it and I framed it in terms of euro is that within the Sarah Thelwell's work for Common Practice London, which is very different actually from the dynamics of Common Practice New York, but Thelwell basically identifies what she considers to be a small scale space to be working on a revenue of £1 million and under, which I think in general in terms of artists run sort of initiatives, there's a difference actually in terms of the finance that needs to be considered. It also said it is diverse, sort of, and I would imagine or assume, because again it's not quantified, that diversification is diversification of both model ostensibly, of the different mechanisms through which artists run sort of environments, as opposed to necessarily spaces, occur, different modes of sort of management, for want of a better term, different modes of organisation, different notions of temporality. One of the questions is on the table here is sustainability, and my sort of question often around sort of artist-run cultures is, do they seek sustainability in terms of individualist models, or does it seek sustainability as a global culture itself? And If the answer is the second, then how does that operate intergenerationally? What is the baton of passing the desire for artist-run cultures across generations of practitioners, as opposed to singularizing it in terms of specific initiatives, spaces, etc.? Though I work in a city in which there's a artist-run space called Gallery 54 that was actually established in 1958, and so the Vienna Secession is actually the oldest artist-run space globally. So there are models of highly sustained sort of spaces in terms of temporalities. When we look at this word situation, the situation of sort of artist-run spaces, I suppose it leads us to begin to consider a set of questions around sort of geographies, locales, but also conditions, the conditions of production, the conditions through which those sort of practices are obligating themselves, and to what modes of urgency are they seeking to actually sort of position themselves against. And I'll talk a little bit from my personal perspective of what I see to be the urgencies myself within a neoliberal sort of moment. How do they differ? And it's an interesting sort of use of terminology that's used here in this interview, because it says, how are they separated? And sort of it doesn't sort of suggest, my sort of personal sort of take on this in a way is that I don't fundamentally believe in sort of independent spaces. I fundamentally believe we are interdependent and not independent. And I think there are many sort of positivistic sort of aspects in humanist terms that are problematic about that. But I think when we reframe ourselves to think of ourselves as being interdependent within an ecology, sort of we have sort of other ways of actually considering and articulating the values and value. And I'm going to speak a little bit about this sort of aspect of what is values and what is value, sort of as well. And so there's this question of labour as well, and I'll sort of address that to some very small extent potentially at the end of my presentation, when I will tell you a little bit more about what Stretch, the research project that I'm about to embark on, seeks to do, because it has a very specific and tight and sort of quite discrete way of considering what that labour might be, but it's not really within labour politics or sort of within the analysis of labour itself. Okay, so I'm Jason E. Bowman. I work at the Valand Academy at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and I run an MFA program in sort of fine art there, but I also work as a researcher, and last year I closed down a 3-year-long sort of a research project that actually was examining trust in relation to contemporary art. And I am not a sociologist, so I need to be clear about that. I'm not an economist either, sort of, and so I approach things very much from a kind of perspective of somebody who trains an artist, then in terms of cultural theory specifically, so a very bastardized sort of notion of philosophy that was accumulating psychoanalytic theory, feminism, etc. So I'm coming from that kind of place, sort of, I'm not a value theorist. I quite often find myself having to do that type of work to a degree, but I'm not actually qualified or trained to produce sociological report in those terms. And I think it's important that some of us at least acknowledge that that's not our skill set, that's not what it is we do, and we're not trained to do it necessarily, and it is difficult stuff to do because it becomes the measurement system. So I want to basically acknowledge that I am not that person. In terms of trust, with the project, what I ended up having to do, of course, was to begin to look at dynamics of trust within public service dynamics, sort of, and how trust influences the nature of how we choose to value and what it is we choose to value within it. And there are certain things I think that are maybe pertinent to mention around that, in a sense, that that we can find people often who will have no use of a service, for want of a better term. Sort of, so I have no kids. Sort of, I will never use the educational services available governmentally for the education of children of my own, but I will still fundamentally politically adhere to the fact that I believe it should exist, and it should be of high quality, and it should be very accessible across class structures. So I trust in the possibility of education, even though potentially I, as a non-parent, I will not actually dynamically use that service. And so I think today it's worth keeping in the back of our heads that not all sort of not all measurement systems are about direct usage. They are actually about public and common good. And I think that's worth us kind of remembering. To maybe tell you a little bit more about sort of Midwest, as Meg said, Midwest was a project that I ran with two other people, a woman called Julie Crawshaw, who became more recently an academic anthropologist, and a woman called Rachel Bradley, who's an art historian and curator. And that project was established in the West Midlands. It was funded by the Arts Council in the West Midlands, and the project was very much emanating from questions of infrastructural development, coming out of the city of Birmingham in the UK, but actually sort of with a fairly sort of extensive sort of reach. And that project did seek to do some things that I think are kind of akin, potentially, in relation to some of the work that Footfalls is beginning to look at. And so, for example, and I'll just talk very briefly about a specific example. We ran a project for, I guess about sort of 6 months, looking at policy intervention and whether policy can actually be artist-led, and what modes of intervention or dynamic would have to be produced in order for artists to actually feasibly be able to intervene in policy mechanisms and policy becoming strategy and the interface between those two things. And we positioned a whole set of artists as a critical mass in relation to a series of both policymakers and sort of people who were working in think tanks. So we worked with the Work Foundation, Demos, who were producing new reports on cultural value at that sort of time. And so we set up basically this sort of fundamental question: can policy be artist-led? Is there a mechanism through which artists can actually produce policy intervention and then recalibrate what the value systems and measurements and metrics around sort of policy can and should be? So my sort of question, in a sense, it's a question for sort of discursive debate, really, rather than one that I will seek to sort of answer here, is I become increasingly aware, I suppose, and I am not a discourse analyst either, so I'm not somebody who basically works from the mode of linguistics in order to understand the sort of terminologies in terms of sort of words, but I have become quite sort of obsessed in a degree around the rhetorics of the artist-led cultures, where we have terminologies such as initiate, entrepreneurial, in a sense, sort of run, management, center, so not peripheral, sort of lead, so leadership. And so these sort of terms sit very much into a sort of current neoliberal politic in a very specific way, but that is not necessarily where they originally come from. And I think it's important that we begin to also consider how we measure actually the rhetoric that we are putting out there against the politics in the neoliberal sort of moment at the same time. What are we either differentiating, separating, or considering to be the flow between these two things in the positioning of art, artists, the conditions for artist making, and the ways in which artists seek to develop and change, adapt, or indeed continue or sustain aspects of their conditioning via artist-led cultures. Okay? So Footfalls itself, I think this is this kind of question of, is this a parochial debate, is it a local debate, is it a national debate, etc. But I want to basically sort of caution us that this is just running through sort of 5 years, and these are just a very few and very limited sort of example of where debates about this are actually taking place. And so I've just returned 2 weeks ago from a conference at Bard College in New York on the future curatorial, where a significant amount of that debate actually was about the interface between large-scale institutions and small-scale sort of institutions. And the event had people from all over the world, attending from very small but very important sort of spaces such as Beirut in Cairo, Chapter House in India, raw material company in Dakar, Senegal, etc. And then there was an initiative in Copenhagen in 2013 called Artist Run, which was a consortium of 32 artist-run spaces in sort of Copenhagen, with a sort of seminar and conference there again, sort of examining these sort of issues. Art Party Conference took place in the UK in 2013, which is very much a question of political dynamic and sort of control of artisphere sort of policy and strategy dynamics. Institutions by Artists, which was organised across the whole of the Pacific Rim, sort of Canada, in Canada, Vancouver, Canada, but also assimilating people from all across sort of Europe, across the Pacific Rim, across Southeast Asia, etc., who were involved in those discourses and debates. Then in 2012, in Dakar, Senegal, organised by the Raw Material Company, was a symposia and then a publication called Building Art Institutions in Africa. Strength in Numbers was another sort of dialogic sort of frame that took place in Southeast Asia in 2013. We are here in Sydney in 2011 when Artist Run Initiatives, as they're called there, hit their 40th anniversary. And actually, 2011 is the 41st year of that type of activity in Canada, where the first national sort of conference for that took place in 2011. Artist Run Chicago. Chicago probably has one of the most sustained sort of artist run sort of cultures sort of globally in North America, and so Artist Run Chicago was a debate platform and a series of publications coming out there in 2009. And then sort of questions of sort of the interface between other sort of dynamics or other modes within it. So, such as the Rotterdam Dialogues organised by Witte de Wit between 2008 and 2009. They were placing curators and artists and producers into sort of dialogic sort of frames. So, I mean, the reason I'm kind of sort of saying that is that, okay, so we're sitting in Galway, etc. today, but actually we are ostensibly in a discursive framework with many other sort of people who are engaged in these sort of debates and these things, despite the difference in sort of policy objectives. So, for example, in a sense, building art institutions in Africa, so the symposium at Dakar was very concerned because there is such little public subsidy, within African states, and we know that Africa is a conceit is quite a complex kind of thing, but they basically are generating sort of spaces very much within public-private partnerships or seeking sort of a foundational sort of support in particular places like the Prince Claus Foundation, which very much seeks to support global social development through sort of ethical means as they understand that to be. Beirut in Cairo is funded really primarily by the Ford Foundation, etc. And interestingly, most small-scale initiatives, for example, in Cairo and across the Middle East, but primarily in Egypt, are actually registered as organisations in Sweden. And so, for example, Beirut is actually an organisation set up by the Swedish art collective Golden Steneby, and Golden Steneby actually are the business of Beirut, because Beirut, as a space in Cairo, is in a very kind of complex set of sort of political dynamics of what it seeks to sort of do. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, by being here today, we are entering into that debate with these types of situations. We are not in some kind of parochial frame, as far as I'm concerned about it. Okay. Some other things that I think that we should recall and remember for ourselves as well, which is that we are not outside of this either. And I'm only really, in a sense, beginning to sort of look at this. I mean, we are in general pretty concerned, I suppose, with understanding artist-run initiatives in terms of the alternative space movement of the 60s and 70s, and most people seek to kind of historically define that as the beginning point, but I think we can actually begin to recalibrate aspects of the art historical around it at the same time. So, for example, the first solo exhibition actually takes place in 1785, and that was Joseph Wright of Derby. So when Joseph Wright of Derby refused his membership of the Royal Academy in London, and his work was highly criticised by the RA, and a decision was made that he would no longer sort of exhibit in that sort of group exhibition at the RA. And through his kind of, sort of resistance to that, he hired an alternative space and set up his own exhibition. And so I think that there are many other art historic models in relation to the artist led that we are currently not really considering when we're having these debates. So one of which is actually prior to prior to sort of Joseph Wright of Derby, you know, sort of collectivity and group exhibition was the primary format from the mid 17th century on, you know, sort of and Derby's sort of initiative of deciding to sort of produce his own solo show to manage it to hire space, etc., is maybe an indicator of something that we are quite often sort of amnesiac about. I think there's very limited research actually has been done on the artist colonies of the sort of early 19th sort of century. There's only sort of two major studies that I'm aware of about that, one of which is by one called Nina Ludgren, who's at the University of East Anglia and an art historian in the UK, which I think is an incredible sort of study actually, you know, sort of where she basically is identifying how these kind of collectors and groups of people were coming together and producing these kind of colonies, but the colonies weren't there solely for the production of art. They were actually there for peer review sort of situations, you know, so people were producing work in tandem discourse and dialogue with each other as small groups of people, and as we all know, some of these things later became what are termed art movements. Obviously, I mean, I guess most people know this, is Salon de Refuse, of which the 1863 sort of edition or iteration, whatever you want to call it, is the one where basically lots of people are sort of chucked out, and they do something else because they've been chucked out in the mainstream sort of system surrounding them. And I think that those types of behaviours lead into sort of mechanisms of sort of communities of interest around sort of practice. I mean, and I think that the transitioning of that community of practice or interest into sort of dynamics of the mainstreaming is a kind of sort of issue that we can basically, if we choose to examine the summer of surrealism, 1936, which is when all four of the major kind of exhibitions on surrealism happened. And in the year before, the Antarctica Kunst, which was the exhibition of degenerate art in sort of Germany, you know, sort of so two other kinds of frames, one of dismissal and one of a re-entry or an entry into the sort of mainstream. We have, I mean, there's other stuff between these two time periods, obviously, but then we enter into the return to space movement in a sense, in which quite often is seen, as I said before, to be that sort of benchmark. But I fundamentally think there is art historical work to be done that allows us to recalibrate how we are thinking and positioning the significance and histories that we're engaging with in terms of the artists led. Then, of course, the DIY party and protest movement of the 1980s, alongside the kind of problematics, as some of us may think of it, of entrepreneurial and the entrepreneurial within sort of DIY movements, with this kind of question of who is the why, really, in DIY, and really is it a me? And I don't think we should necessarily be avoiding that either. You know, so the question of how models move from radicalism towards self-aggrandizing, and I think it would be very dangerous to actually be sort of avoiding that question. Okay. We also see what some people may term assimilation of sort of artist-run cultures into sort of mainstream dynamics, and these are only three sort of very small sort of examples of exhibitions. So No Soul for Sale at sort of Tate Modern, wearing sort of multiple sort of independents, as they were terming it, though as I said before I've got a problem with that term, but you know, sort of independents were all co-exhibiting in the Turbine Hall. You know, sort of none of the people were paid to do that. None of them actually had any of the transport expenses paid, etc. You know, sort of so, but a huge kind of sort of exhibition or festival, tricky one. You know, sort of in that sort of time period. Charles Esch and Huhan Ru's exhibition for the Quanju Biennial Pause, where they basically handed over the sort of biennial content to the dynamics of artist-run spaces globally. You know, sort of alongside some other exhibitionary models. And then, of course, one that's discussed quite regularly, which is Life Live at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, curated by Hans-Ulrich Oberst. So we're also not in a situation where significant global power players in terms of the curatorial are either rejecting, avoiding, or ignoring these types of cultures either, and they are assimilated and transitioned into those sort of things. And I think if you look at the difference between Common Practice London and Common Practice New York, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, what is also happening there is that they are directly seeking assimilation into broader political kind of structures or exhibitionary institutional sort of structures, and you can see that at play very much also within the curatorial So work of, for example, of institutions like the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, where quite often you will see what are deemed to be sort of more radical modes of practice being swept into the institutional sort of frame. Okay. I also, in a sense, want to sort of caution us that in terms of literature, we're not in a paucity of literature about this either. And this might be quite an illegible sort of slide in a sense, but this is, and that slide continues like this, sort of, and these are only two sort of slides, and this is basically the letter A of 690 publications that I've surveyed around the culture of these kind of questions. So it is not that the literature necessarily doesn't exist either. And I brought sort of I brought out 3 publications with me today. One of which is Institutions by Artists publication coming out of the event in Vancouver, which many people are probably aware of, published by Philip. People are maybe less aware, actually, of the one coming from Africa, the Symposium on Building Art Institutions in Africa, but I just brought it, people can browse these things. And then a very recent publication by a guy called Lane Relia, Your Everyday Art World. I don't know if people are aware of this, which very much is questioning the interface of DIY to sort of neoliberal sort of dynamics, and then something that we're all probably quite conscious of, which is Gregory Chalette's Dark Matter, about the invisibility of certain modes of practice. But so it's not that we don't also have those sort of tools of publication. Some of these publications are anthological, some of them are sort of dealing with the archival, some of them are very much positioning themselves as manifestos, some of them are dealing with feminist history, some of them are dealing with queer histories, some of them are dealing with new institutionalization, new institutional politics, new mechanisms of curatorial, etc. But I think we should always remember that these things actually are out, they exist, and they can also be used for argument. Okay. I always like to have a bit of Hannah Arendt. And I can't really live without Hannah Arendt, and I want to basically, I'm just going to show a very small number of slides about this, but I mean, I would feel incredibly disingenuous if I wasn't suggesting that we are in both a moment of crisis and a moment of urgency, and it very much is about the dynamics of power. So, as Arendt, this is from section 28 of the Human Condition, which is the section on power and the space of appearance, and it's about the contingency of political kind of communities, and how sort of Arendt is kind of considering what a politicized community would be. This from 1958. So, power is actualized only where word and deed have not parted company, where words are not empty and deeds not brutal, where words are not used to veil intentions but to disclose realities, and deeds are not used to violate and destroy but to establish relations and create new realities. At the same time, in reflecting back to Arendt in sort of 58, we are in the situation that basically she's cautioning us against, in a sense, which is a moment of de-imagining and a moment of depoliticizing. And there is a demand, as I'm sure we're all aware, and a demand in a sense that produces this type of sort of situation where artists respond, by producing this type of evidence for, the demand for their sort of well-being, which is we are being basically relegated into a casino situation, in a casino situation of capital, and where we all as citizens are in a struggle to basically fight for the maintenance of the polis, for the space for critical subjectivity to exist. And for me personally, and I've reviewed a lot of work on articulating kind of cultural value, and I have not to date in any of that sort of literature, apart from Mikhail's report, actually, is one of the few reports I've seen where there is actually a consideration of the necessity for those spaces, or for art and for artists, for one of those values to be critique. in all my sort of literature review around cultural value, I'm yet to see a single one of those reports fully identify the right to critique as a fundamental mechanism of cultural value. And it is also a moment where, in the individualization of us all, we are basically being pushed into a situation where the comprehension of how we interconnect and become, or maybe interdependent, is being curtailed, basically. And it's being curtailed in ways that produce some modes of parochialism that are allowed to be dismissed at the same time. And so again, I'm sort of cautioning us to think about how do we, in the situation that we're here today, begin to think beyond those sort of things and what the actual sort of desires, impacts of these situations are, because sort of in that sort of situation, as civil society actually produces situations where critical thought is under attack, and becomes unsustained and short-lived. So, sort of whilst we kind of can consider the model of the artist's run and its sort of sustainability, we also have to think about actually what is it fundamentally there to do? What is its job, actually? And if its job is to sustain dynamics for critical thought, then how do we allow that to operate as a model and a set of systems that can consider itself amidst the short-lived, the fickle, and the ephemeral? So it's a question really of what can hold us together within shared responsibility, rather than operate consistently from a position of fear or competitive struggle. One of the consequences of an anti-politic is the discourse of privatization, possessive individualism, and materialism inundate every aspect of social life, making it easy for us to lose our faith in the critical function of civic education, civic cultures, and of open and substantive modes of democracy. And my personal perception quite often is that sort of policy mechanisms around sort of value are one of the steering and controlling mechanisms through which this situation exists. And I think that's worth considering here today. Also, what really do we begin to engage with when we start to play ball amidst sort of notions of articulating those values? When, as far as I'm concerned, what it is, on one hand, we have to really think through again, collectively as communities of people, is what are our values before we hit the articulation of value. I'll skip that. I'm seeing, are people aware of this notion of instituting as opposed to the institutional? It's something I'm seeing quoted quite regularly again within the literature around sort of artist run or small scale initiatives or the curatorial, etc. So as I look at the kind of situation in the Middle East or sort of or Africa around sort of small scale spaces and initiatives, I'm finding a lot of the discourse is actually focusing on this, that those small scale spaces are arguing that they are producing new institutional models, and to have the fleetness of foot to be able to do so. But this quote is from an article called Instituent Practices, number 2, Institutional Critique, Constituent Power and the Persistence of Instituting Discourse. And it was published in Contemporary Art Magazine spring 2008, edited by a guy called Pelin Tan, who's been doing a significant amount of writing, including in analysis in Norway of artist-run sort of cultures, but what Raunig is basically suggesting is that we are constantly sort of able to reinstitute ourselves, and to develop models of how that instituting takes place in ways that will tie us into sort of political struggle, both at local and global sort of level. And a lot of kind of artist-run cultures are basically now sort of using these sort of Raunig sort of philosophical thoughts to basically demonstrate and what it is they think their true job at hand is, which is to consider new public realms within the dynamic of the neoliberal. I want to remind us actually also of this, which this is a slightly bastardized and paraphrasing sort of version of Julie Alt's sort of definition of alternativity within the alternative art scene in New York from her sort of publication on that. And I suppose in placing it here just as a sort of temperature gauging sort of thing, so like, is this what we still think is at stake for us? Is this what we still think we are doing, etc.? Or are we doing something else? And should we be doing something else? Is this a moment of nostalgia? And I don't mean that in sort of Walter Benjamin's terms of nostalgia, where we, by revisiting the past, we can reconceive of the radical, but through the kind of more conservative notion of nostalgia. And is it actually if we basically believe these are still the values, is it an accurate picture of how we model the processes, projects, the exhibitions that we make, and the curatorial dynamics through which we operate? So, 1, to challenge the encounter power dynamics and exclusion of artists through sort of identity by gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and then to reconsider the canon and to infiltrate notions of the canonical through sort of identities, subjectivities which are refused by the kind of standard canon. So are we still engaged with that within the artist run or led? Do we still produce alternative contexts and environments for people to generate, exhibit and debate artworks that are being discounted by institutional frameworks, including expanded media? So are there new notions of sort of media that are coming into play, so historically performance, new media, etc., that those kind of spaces we're adhering to and developing as platforms, so are we still at the point where not as individuals but as a sort of dynamic feeling excluded by those institutions, when I've already sort of told us that many of those institutions and biennials are actually operating through the assimilation or transportability of those types of platforms in it? Is this still the case? Are we still having to argue the question of autonomy in terms of sort of authorship, or are we so comfortable now with collaboration and collectivity that no longer is sort of seen to be an alternate sort of value? And if we think about how artists run spaces quite often within their rhetoric, consider themselves either as horizontal or with sort of different sort of modes of hierarchical management, sort of systems or modes of production within them, are we still considered as communities of interest with a specific dynamic or sort of political place that we're doing? And when we think about that sort of notion of the network, what actually fundamentally do we mean by that? Are we actually engaging with supporting situations in other places of political crisis or artistic crisis? Or are we basically comfortably recycling ourselves in terms of those networks? What is our job in actually fundamentally doing that? And I think we have to be conscious at the same time of work around other rhetorics, such as the network, the database, the platform as a curatorial model, and what it is we are linguistically doing when we begin to buy into these sort of curatorial terms and terminologies. Are we geographically specific and local? Are we truly national? Is this a national debate? Is it a global debate? Is it a local debate? Or is it all these things? To circumnavigate the market, are we able to circumnavigate the market still? And in circumnavigating the market, does it genuinely position us in these different notions of the countercultural, the alternative, the subcultural, the avant-gardist, the pedagogic, the communitarian, the activist, and the oppositional? Is it still sort of doing those things? So do we believe that countercultural still exists? Can artist-run culture still be counter to anything at all? We'll skip a few sort of slides. Oh, the mouse operates in the opposite direction from mine. I go backwards here, so it's fine. I'm going to tell you a bit about sort of Stretched itself. Maybe sort of start with this. I think that there's a massive literature and cultural sort of value, and I won't go into the common practice sort of things, reports of sort of Thelwell in any sort of detail, but I mean, Mikhail references in his report as well. But I think there's a set of other work being done that is worth kind of sort of also considering, such as Mark Moore's sort of definition of what cultural value is, which is that it's generated and exists in context, the space in which objects and performances appear, and their critical reception and the climate of public and political opinion all influence cultural value. So a much more enmeshed and interrelational sort of idea, as opposed to some theorists like Sacco, who's very into sort of separating things out into the impact on health and well-being, so the instrumental sort of situation. And I think there, in terms of this sort of question, I think there are other questions that we should be beginning to sort of ask around how, not what is the value and how is it articulated, but how actually is the value produced itself? What mechanisms, behaviours, modes of engagement, conduct, practice are at play within this? You know, sort of, and some of the ones that I'm sort of seeing through the sort of literature and, you know, sort of people that I'm meeting, etc., are notions of transferability. You know, sort of in that within the network, people are not just transferring sort of artworks, they're transferring people, they're transferring ideologies, they're transferring themselves across small-scale institutions to large-scale institutions. Artists are no longer sort of parameterizing themselves as an eye-only exhibit within an artist-run cultures or spaces. They're moving from major sort of museological frameworks into very small spaces and then back out, etc. So we're in an enmeshed sort of network where those sort of institutions are sort of transferring between them all. I think there are many things within artist-run sort of cultures that we don't know about in terms of the curatorial. It is a massively undersubscribed area of consideration. We don't know very much about it at all, which is one of the things I'm about to sort of look at in terms of my own sort of research. Absorption, you know, sort of, and into what are we absorbed? And today, I suppose, we're absorbed into this, which is a question of articulating sort of value. And I suppose I'm conscious of, okay, so what modes of distraction occur for us? How do we become distracted from the true sort of job at hand, in a sense, to answering to a set of questions that potentially maybe aren't actually relevant to what it is we do. Commitment versus content, and I think this is, to me, in a sense, fundamentally key actually in this notion of separating or distinction of what is artist-led, artist-run or not. And, you know, so, and for me, in a sense, I think that the transportability across generations of sort of practitioners is telling us something about that commitment, in a sense, that I'm sitting here at 50 years old and I still fundamentally, for want of a better term, consider myself, even amidst the problematics of it all, a believer in those kind of sets of conditions. I'm not 23, I haven't just left art school, I'm not looking for a platform to sort of learn a set of skills that kind of push me into the next element of a career. You know, sort of, and I think that the very, yeah, I'm not going to use this word flexible, I really hate it, yeah. But we are sort of, we have the possibility to consider actually notions of commitment versus content. Many other institutional frames are very considered with content-driven activity, but actually we concern ourselves with commitment. And I think there is a discursive set of questions to be asked about that. And then, of course, as I've said a couple of times, the generational sustainability of the models. I'll conclude by just telling you very briefly what stretch does a research project seeks to sort of do. And yeah, you know, sort of, the only reason that actually this information tells you the amount of money granted to this sort of project is for two purposes. One, to be very transparent about it politically, and so this is public information, public knowledge. And the second thing is basically to inform you that at least there are some people listening to the importance of what it is you're doing. You know, so when there are certain sort of situations where people will fund that research to support that type of dynamic. So it's not any flash thing of, oh, I've raised €500,000. That actually, this is now sort of entering into sort of research field in a way. But okay, you know, so the aim of Stretched is to contribute new knowledge of fine art practice and its affects, through researching how practice is constituted, expanded, and stretched within the artist-led and its cultures. We aim to find new ways to understand, describe, and exhibit the intricacies of practice as experience and behaviour and as modes of the curatorial. So what basically I want to find out through my sort of 3 years of research is that within these hybridized set of behaviours that take place within artist-led cultures, so artist curator, artist educator, artist organiser, etc., 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 most of these people fundamentally believe themselves to be doing all of those tasks, including all the shitty ones, as artists. And yet, when we consider what we think practice to be, we quite often are willing to exclude all of that sort of labour within that understanding of what the artist is. It's frequently bounced back out of all the representations, including policy agendas, of what those artists are doing. You know, so it's basically amnesia around it. And in a sense, artist-led sort of cultures is one of the few distinct arenas that actually those types of things are determined as practice by artists. Thank you.